The crew of the Resolute had never seen anything like it. The attack came without warning, and with deadly force from the moment the enemy ships appeared in the distance. The entire crew went into immediate action, but it was clear from the start that they were outmatched. The Rethar fleet was enormous, massive ships, like dark predators closing in on their prey. They moved with a precision that was terrifyingly coordinated. The humans tried to fight back with everything they had, but their weapons felt like toys against the onslaught. Nothing could penetrate the enemy ship's shields. As they were torn apart one by one, the crew of the Resolute scrambled to defend their vessel, but it was hopeless. The battle was lost before it even began. Captain Marlowe stood on the bridge watching as their fate unraveled. She gave the orders. She could feel the weight of every decision pressing on her chest. The crew followed her lead, though the grim reality was clear. The Resolute wasn't going to survive this attack. Suddenly, the ship shuddered as a wave of energy exploded against the hull. Sparks flew from every console. The walls buckled under the pressure, and alarms screamed in the background. The lights flickered and then went out, leaving them in an eerie silence. Marlowe's voice cut through the stillness, commanding the crew to evacuate into escape pods. The cold truth set in: the flagship was being torn apart, and there was no time to think of anything but survival. The crew scrambled, running down corridors that had once been the heart of their great warship, now reduced to chaos and destruction. There was no time to mourn the loss of their ship or their comrades. They just had to get to safety. Marlowe had barely made it to the pod bay when another explosion sent her crashing to the ground. The walls around her groaned and buckled with the force of the blast. The floor tilted, and she had to grip onto a handrail to keep from falling. The ship was falling apart beneath her feet. She forced herself to her feet and stumbled toward the nearest pod. As the emergency lights flickered back on, she saw the faces of the survivors, those who hadn't been taken by the ship's destruction, and those who had managed to make it to safety. They were all wide-eyed with fear, but there was no time for comfort or words. Marlowe rushed them into the pods and activated the launch sequence. She watched as one by one the pods blasted away from the Resolute, escaping into the void of space. Marlowe barely had time to breathe before the last pod launched. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched their once proud flagship continue to break apart in front of her. She knew in that moment that humanity's greatest hope had just been reduced to debris in space. Their only chance now was to survive. But she wasn't ready to give up yet. There had to be more to this. Something in her gut told her that the story wasn't over. It couldn't be. There had to be something she hadn't seen yet, something buried beneath the wreckage of the Resolute, something that could turn the tide of the war and bring them back from the brink of defeat. As the escape pods drifted farther from the wreckage of the Resolute, the crew gathered in the dark and quiet of the makeshift shelter they had set up in one of the surviving pods. The hum of the life support system was the only sound that filled the void. Marlowe couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her like a second skin. Despite the survival of the crew, despite their escape, there was a hollow sense of loss that refused to let go. The ship, the pride of humanity's fleet, was gone, and in its place only the empty cold of space remained. Marlowe's mind raced as she stared out the small viewport of the pod. The remains of the Resolute were barely visible now, just a mass of broken metal and drifting debris. There was no sign of the Rethar fleet. The enemy had moved on, or perhaps they were lying in wait. She didn't know, but what she did know was that humanity couldn't afford to sit idly by and hope for rescue. They had to survive and rebuild. But how could they rebuild with nothing left? The other survivors gathered around a small table in the center of the pod. One of them, a young engineer named Callum, was holding up a set of data pads covered in static and blinking lights. Marlowe stood and walked over to him. As she did, she noticed the fear in the others' eyes. They were scared, and who could blame them? They had just lost everything: their families, their homes, their entire way of life. But now wasn't the time to give in to fear. They needed to think clearly. They needed to find a way forward. Callum looked up at her, his face pale but determined. "Captain, we might have something here," he said as he handed her the data pads. Marlowe took them and began scanning through the corrupted files. The tech had survived the attack, but just barely. There was no telling what they might find. But then something caught her eye. Buried deep in the data was a set of blueprints. The designs were unlike anything she had ever seen before. At first glance, they appeared to be just another experimental tech gone wrong. But as Marlowe studied them, she realized something. They weren't human. These weren't designs they had created. They were ancient, hidden beneath the layers of the Resolute systems, as if they had been placed there on purpose. Her heart raced as she pieced together the fragments of information. The designs were for a new type of ship, a vessel unlike anything they had ever built, a ship that could adapt and evolve based on its surroundings and needs. Marlowe's mind started to race. Could this be the key? Could this be what they needed to turn the tide of the war against the Rethar? She looked around at her crew, their faces uncertain but hopeful, and she knew in that moment that they had to try. They had nothing left, but they had their ingenuity and their will to survive. She turned to Callum and the others. Okay, she said, we rebuild. We start with this. This could be our way back. We might not have much, but if we can get this technology working, we could turn the tide of this war and show the Rethar that humanity is far from finished. The crew worked tirelessly in the days that followed. Their makeshift home in the escape pod became a workshop as they salvaged what they could from the wreckage of the Resolute. Every corner was filled with discarded parts, wires, and tools thrown across the floor as they focused on the alien blueprints. Marlowe had seen something in those designs that no one else had: the potential to create something more than a ship, something alive in its own right, something that could change everything. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. The team split into smaller groups, each working on a different section of the plan. Callum led the engineering team, while Marlowe focused on deciphering the ship's core principles. The most critical piece of the puzzle was understanding how to activate and integrate the alien technology with what was left of the Resolute systems. But they weren't just rebuilding a warship, they were building a weapon, a tool for survival, a symbol of humanity's last stand. As the days turned into weeks, the crew felt the strain, but they kept at it. Each time they hit a roadblock, they pushed forward, refusing to give up. As the final components began to come together, Marlowe could feel the weight of what they were doing on her shoulders. But there was no turning back now. They had no choice but to see this through. Callum stood beside her as the first of the ship's new systems came online. The hum of the engines started weak at first, but it grew louder as the ship seemed to come to life beneath their hands. The hull began to glow with a faint light as the integration of alien technology started to take shape. Marlowe watched in awe as the once dead ship slowly began to function once more. But this was no longer the Resolute. It was something new, a living vessel that could adapt to the changing environment of space and the ever-evolving threats of their enemies. The transformation was slow but steady, and the crew began to sense the immense power. They were awakening a power unlike any ship had ever known. The ship's weapon systems were next. The integration was painstaking, but each time they tested the new weapons, they saw the potential to strike down the Rethar with precision and force. They had built something beyond their understanding, but with it came hope, a new kind of hope. The ship's eye was the final piece of the puzzle. It had been dormant for so long, but now it began to stir. It wasn't just a ship's computer. It was a sentient entity capable of learning, adapting, and evolving just like the ship itself. The crew had only begun to scratch the surface of what this new intelligence could do, but already it was clear this was no mere machine. It was a partner, a co-conspirator in their fight for survival. On the eve of the ship's first test flight, Marlowe stood alone on the observation deck, gazing out at the stars. The vastness of space had never seemed so small. She knew the Rethar were still out there, still waiting to finish what they started, but humanity wasn't finished. Not yet. They had rebuilt, they had adapted, and they were ready to fight back. The Phoenix was ready to rise. The day had finally come. The Phoenix was ready for its first test flight. Marlowe stood on the bridge, staring at the view screen. As the ship powered up beneath her feet, every system hummed with life in ways they had never imagined possible. The new ship was unlike anything humanity had ever built. It had the speed and agility of a fighter with the firepower of a battleship, and something more, an underlying sense of purpose that seemed to pulse through its very core. Callum and the rest of the crew were on standby, ready for anything as Marlowe gave the order to launch. As the Phoenix lifted off from its temporary dock, the crew felt the strange sensation of weightlessness. Not just from the ship's movement, but from the sheer power that was now at their disposal. Marlowe's fingers flew across the console, her hands moving with precision as she tested the ship's systems. One by one, shields activated, engines roared into life, and weapons systems powered up. The feeling of invincibility washed over her, but there was no time to linger. They needed to see how the ship performed in action. Marlowe issued commands to the AI, pushing the ship to its limits, testing its speed and maneuverability. The ship responded with flawless execution. It moved as if it was an extension of her own thoughts, faster and more agile than anything she had ever piloted. The crew watched in stunned silence as the Phoenix darted through space, twisting and turning with ease. But it wasn't enough just to test the ship's speed, it had to be a weapon too. With a single command, Marlowe activated the ship's weapons systems. The hull vibrated as a series of energy pulses shot from the ship's cannons. They collided with asteroids floating nearby, vaporizing them in a brilliant flash. The ship's firepower was far beyond anything the Grethar had ever seen, but what made the Phoenix truly dangerous was its ability to adapt mid-flight. Every shot recalibrated based on the target's composition. Its energy shields adjusted to absorb incoming fire in real time, and its AI analyzed the battlefield faster than any human or alien ever could. It was working perfectly. Marlowe's heart raced with excitement. They had created something far more powerful than they could have dreamed. But as she looked around at her crew, she knew that it wasn't just the ship that made this moment possible. It was the will to survive, the determination to not let the Grethar erase humanity from existence. They had faced impossible odds and come through on the other side stronger than ever. But now the real test was yet to come. Suddenly, the calm of the test flight was shattered by a series of alarms. A ship had entered the area. A Grethar scout vessel had detected the Phoenix, and it was moving toward them at incredible speed. Marlowe's first instinct was to engage, but she hesitated for a moment, realizing that this was no longer just a test. This was the beginning of a war. The Phoenix was ready to fight, but they couldn't afford to waste it on a small skirmish. They had to prepare for the Grethar's full fleet and make sure they could survive the next wave. She gave the order to evade, but the Grethar ship was closing in too quickly. The battle had already begun. The Grethar scout vessel closed in rapidly, its weapons glowing ominously in the void of space. Marlowe's hands tightened around the controls as she ordered the crew to prepare for battle. The Phoenix had been designed to outmaneuver anything the enemy could throw at them. But this was their first real test. Since its rebirth, she felt the ship respond beneath her fingers. It was as if the Phoenix was alive, with a will of its own, sensing the tension in the air and ready to fight. The Grethar ship fired first, its blasts of energy streaking toward the Phoenix, but Marlowe was already a step ahead. She slammed the control yoke to one side, and the Phoenix veered sharply, dodging the incoming fire with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. The enemy ship wasn't prepared for such a quick reaction, and its shots missed wide, leaving it vulnerable. Marlowe didn't waste a second. She gave the command to fire, and the Phoenix responded with deadly precision. The ship's cannons unleashed a series of pulse blasts that tore through the enemy ship's shields with ease. The Grethar vessel staggered, but quickly retaliated, its weapons firing again in rapid succession. This time, the Phoenix wasn't fast enough. The first blast hit their shields with a violent jolt, and the second connected with the hull, sending a shower of sparks through the ship. Marlowe cursed under her breath, but she didn't panic. She knew the Phoenix could take it, and they could adjust in real time. The shields recharged almost immediately, and the hull repair systems kicked in, restoring the ship's integrity. Callum's voice came through the comms. "Captain, the Phoenix is handling the damage well. We've got this." But Marlowe wasn't so sure. They had just scratched the surface of the Grethar's firepower, and this was only a scout ship. What would happen when the full fleet arrived? They had to end this quickly before the Grethar could call for reinforcements. She gave the order to go on the offensive. The Phoenix accelerated forward, using its speed and agility to close the gap with the enemy vessel. It dodged every attack the Grethar ship fired, but the Grethar were no slouches, and they quickly adapted to the Phoenix's movements with deadly accuracy. The battle was becoming more intense, but Marlowe knew they had the advantage. They were faster, more unpredictable, and with the ship's advanced targeting systems, they could strike with deadly precision. Marlowe ordered a concentrated barrage of energy blasts aimed at the Rethar ship's engine core. If they could disable the engines, the battle would be over in seconds. The Phoenix fired, and the enemy ship was hit directly. The Rethar vessel's engines flared and then exploded in a brilliant burst of light, sending the ship spiraling into the abyss. For a moment, everything was still. The battle was over. The Rethar scout ship had been destroyed, but Marlowe knew this was only the beginning. The Rethar had now felt the Phoenix's power, and they would not underestimate humanity again. The real war was coming, but for the first time in a long while, Marlowe felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Humanity had a fighting chance. As the crew gathered on the bridge to assess the damage and repair systems, Marlowe turned to them. She could see the weariness in their eyes, but also something else, a determination. They had been through the worst, but now they had something the Rethar couldn't anticipate: a force that could adapt, grow, and fight back. The Phoenix was only the beginning. The battle with the Rethar scout ship had been a small victory, but it was enough to send ripples through the vastness of space. Marlowe knew that the Rethar fleet would be coming soon, and they would be prepared. The Phoenix was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of humanity's resilience, a force that could change the tide of the war if they played their cards right. But they needed more than just one ship to stand against the might of the Rethar. Marlowe gathered her crew in the briefing room, where the tension was palpable. Everyone was on edge, still riding the high of their recent success. But they knew that the real fight was ahead of them. Marlowe stood at the head of the table and looked around at the faces of the people who had given everything to rebuild humanity's hope. "Captain Marlowe, we have a chance to turn the tables here," said Callum, his voice steady, but filled with urgency. "We can't take on the entire Rethar fleet with just one ship, but we can rally other survivors. We can rebuild our forces. We can bring together every resistance group in the galaxy." Marlowe nodded. She had already been thinking the same thing, but hearing it aloud made it feel more real. "We need to create a fleet," she said. "The Phoenix will be the heart of it, but we need to find others who can stand with us. We need to make contact with the outer colonies, the rebel groups, the ones who are still out there fighting in the shadows, the ones who haven't given up yet." The crew immediately began working on a plan to reach out to every corner of humanity's scattered forces. With the Phoenix as their flagship, they would offer a symbol of hope and strength to every group that had been struggling to survive the Rethar's brutal conquest. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only chance they had. As the days passed, the crew worked tirelessly to prepare the Phoenix for its next mission, to bring the scattered human forces together. Marlowe could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her, but she couldn't afford to let fear control her. Now they had already come so far, and she knew that this was the only way forward. Callum and the engineering team worked on enhancing the Phoenix's capabilities, integrating more advanced technology into the ship and optimizing its systems for long-term operations, while the comms team sent out encrypted messages across the galaxy, reaching out to the distant colonies and resistance groups. The messages were brief and to the point, but they carried the weight of a promise. They were not alone. The Phoenix was here, and it was ready to fight. The response was slow at first, but then came the first reply. A small colony on the fringe of the galaxy had received the message, and they were ready to join the fight. Soon after, another resistance group contacted them, then another, and another, until the messages started coming in faster than they could keep up with. Humanity was rallying together. They were beginning to believe again. Marlowe stood on the bridge of the Phoenix, watching the stars stretch before them as they began to chart their course toward the first of their new allies. This was just the beginning, but it felt like the tide was finally turning. They were no longer alone in this fight. They had the beginnings of a fleet, a force that could stand against the Rethar, and with every passing moment their power was growing. The first stop was a small colony on the edge of the galaxy. Marlowe and the crew had already prepared for what they might face. They knew the Rethar had been relentless in their attacks, and the colonies out here were struggling to survive. They weren't sure how many would have the strength or the resources to join them, but they had to try. This was the first real test of their newfound hope. The Phoenix had been a symbol of survival so far, but now it had to become a rallying point for humanity. As they approached the colony, the atmosphere on the bridge was tense. Marlowe gave orders to maintain a low profile. They didn't want to alarm anyone, But they also couldn't afford to be seen as weak. They needed to show that they were ready to fight and ready to defend those who would stand with them. The colony's defense system detected the Phoenix before they could make contact, but instead of immediately firing it, simply issued a warning to stand down. Marlowe decided to take the risk. She ordered the comms team to establish a direct line, and within moments the face of the colony leader appeared on the view screen, a grizzled older man with a face that looked as though it had been weathered by years of hardship. His eyes narrowed as he spoke. "This is Commander Rylos of Colony 5, he said. "What do you want?" Marlowe kept her voice steady. "Commander, we come in peace. We offer you a chance to fight back against the Rethar. We are building a fleet, and we need your help. The Phoenix is a symbol of humanity's strength and resilience, and we want you to join us in taking the fight to the enemy." Rylos studied her for a long moment, and Marlowe could feel the weight of his gaze through the screen. He was deciding whether to trust them or not. Marlowe didn't blame him. Their entire existence had been a fight for survival, and the Rethar's cruelty had left its mark on everyone. But then Rylos spoke. "You're asking us to put our faith in you after everything we've lost, after everything we've seen. You're asking us to trust you with our lives." Marlowe didn't flinch. "We're asking you to fight for your future, and for the future of all humanity. The Rethar have underestimated us for too long. They think they can wipe us out, but they're wrong. We're stronger than they realize, and together we can end this war." There was a long silence, and Marlowe held her breath, waiting for the commander's response. She could hear murmurs in the background from the colony's council members. Then Rylos spoke again. "All right," he said, "we'll join you, but we need more than promises. We need proof that you can do what you say you can do. If you're going to lead us into this fight, show us that you can win." Marlowe smiled. Finally, a chance to prove that their hope wasn't misplaced. She looked at the crew as they prepared for the next phase of the mission. They had taken the first step. Now it was time to show the galaxy what they were capable of. They would fight for every colony, for every human who had been forced to hide in the shadows. The Phoenix had become a symbol of hope, but now it would become a weapon for justice. The decision had been made. The colony of Colony 5 had pledged its support to the Phoenix and humanity's fight against the Rethar. Marlowe could feel the shift in the air, the uncertainty and fear that had lingered around them, now replaced with a spark of hope. They had taken the first step, but the battle was far from over. As the colony began to prepare its forces to join the new fleet, Marlowe knew they needed more. They needed to hit the Rethar where it hurt and show the galaxy that humanity was no longer just surviving, they were fighting back. Callum and the engineering team worked to retrofit the Phoenix. With new upgrades, the ship had been a symbol of power, but now it had to become a weapon capable of leading an entire fleet against the Rethar forces. They had salvaged as much as they could from the wreckage of the Resolute and the alien technology, but now they had to push it to the limit. They would need every advantage they could get as the Rethar fleet drew closer. Marlowe stood on the bridge watching as the first wave of allies arrived. More ships came in from distant colonies, each one a testament to humanity's refusal to surrender. The fleet was growing piece by piece, and every ship that joined brought with it the hope of a future they could still shape together. Marlowe looked out at the stars ahead of them. The Rethar were out there, but they were no longer the unstoppable force they once seemed to be. Humanity was united, and that unity was their strength. As the fleet assembled and the final preparations were made, Marlowe called a meeting with the commanders of the other ships. They gathered in the briefing room to discuss the plan for the upcoming battle. They had a small fleet, but it was strong, and it was growing by the hour. Commander Rylos stood alongside her, the newly allied forces ready to take their first step toward victory. "We have one chance to strike back at the heart of the Rethar fleet," Rylos said, his voice grim but resolute. "The Phoenix will be our vanguard, but we need to hit hard and fast. We need to catch them off guard." Marlowe nodded. The Rethar might have underestimated humanity once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. She could feel the intensity of the moment. The stakes had never been higher, and for the first time in a long while she felt something. She hadn't allowed herself to feel fear, but not in the way it had once gripped her before. Now it was the kind of fear that comes before something great, the kind that fuels determination and resolve. They were going to do this. The plan was simple but risky. The fleet would strike at the Rethar supply lines and key staging areas. They would hit them hard and fast, crippling their ability to fight back and give humanity a fighting chance. Marlowe knew it was a gamble, but she had no doubt that they had the will to succeed. They were no longer just survivors, they were warriors. As the fleet set course for the Rethar stronghold, Marlowe stood on the bridge looking out at the stars once again. She could feel the power of the Phoenix beneath her feet, and she knew it was more than just a ship. It was humanity's last hope, and they were going to make sure the Rethar knew it.